There's a moment almost everyone recognizes, even if they've never put words to it, the moment you realize someone's treatment of you has quietly shifted from valuing your presence to simply expecting it. It doesn't usually announce itself. There's no single conversation, no clear line you can point to. It just accumulates, slowly, until one day you notice that your effort goes unacknowledged, your presence goes unremarked upon, your absence, if it happened, might not even be noticed for a while. And in that moment, most people do the same thing. Almost instinctively, they try harder. More effort, more patience, more evidence of their worth, hoping that somewhere in that additional effort, the old appreciation will finally return. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to be direct about the simple trick this title promises, because it deserves honest framing rather than a gimmick. What we're actually examining is a specific, counterintuitive shift, one that goes directly against the instinct almost everyone has when they sense their value declining in someone else's eyes. It isn't a manipulation tactic, and it isn't about playing games with someone's emotions. It's something considerably more grounded, and by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why it works, why it feels so difficult to actually do, and what it reveals, often within a surprisingly short window, about the relationship you're actually in. Let's start with understanding why the instinctive response, trying harder so reliably, fails to restore the appreciation it's meant to recover. This is worth examining precisely because it explains the entire mechanism this exploration is built around. When someone begins taking your presence for granted, what's actually happening underneath the surface is a shift in perceived scarcity. Remember something worth understanding as a basic principle of human psychology, not specific to any particular relationship dynamic. People tend to value what feels uncertain or effortful to obtain, and they tend to undervalue what feels guaranteed, freely available regardless of their own behavior toward it. When your effort remains constant, or even increases in response to declining appreciation, you're inadvertently confirming again and again that your presence requires no particular investment on their part in order to remain reliably available. The harder you try, the more guaranteed you appear, and the more guaranteed you appear, the less scarce, and therefore the less valuable your presence registers as being. This is worth sitting with directly because it explains something genuinely counterintuitive that trips up almost everyone the first time they encounter it. Increased effort, however well-intentioned, however genuinely loving, often accelerates rather than reverses the exact decline it's meant to prevent. This isn't because effort itself is bad, and it isn't because you should never try to nurture a relationship you value. It's because effort offered unconditionally, regardless of how it's being received or reciprocated, removes exactly the information the other person would otherwise need in order to accurately register what your continued presence actually costs or what its absence might actually mean. Let's talk about the simple trick itself now, because it's worth stating plainly before we examine why it works. The trick is this. Instead of increasing your effort in response to declining appreciation, deliberately, temporarily, withdraw a small, specific portion of it and watch, honestly and without predetermined conclusions, what actually happens next. This might mean not reaching out first for a stretch of time you'd normally initiate contact. It might mean declining an invitation you'd normally accept automatically, prioritizing something else instead. It might mean simply allowing a conversation to end without your usual effort to extend it, to smooth over any awkwardness, to ensure the interaction feels as pleasant and effortless for the other person as you've become accustomed to making it. Here's why this small, deliberate withdrawal reveals something considerably more valuable than continued effort ever could. It removes the guarantee. For the first time in what may have been a considerable stretch of taken-for-granted presence, your continued availability becomes genuinely uncertain rather than reliably assumed. And this uncertainty produces one of two responses, both of which carry genuine, useful information. Either the other person notices the absence, registers some discomfort at the shift, and makes some effort, however small, to reconnect or re-establish the previous level of engagement, or they don't notice at all, continuing forward exactly as before, entirely unaffected by your withdrawal, revealing something important about how genuinely invested they actually were in your presence to begin with. This is worth understanding as the actual mechanism behind why this simple shift produces such clarity, often within a remarkably short window of time. You're not trying to manipulate anyone into valuing you through some clever psychological trick designed to produce a specific engineered outcome. You're simply removing the constant variable, your unconditional, ever-present effort, that has been making it genuinely impossible to see how this person actually behaves when your presence isn't guaranteed. What remains, once that variable is removed, is considerably more honest information than anything continued effort could ever reveal, because continued effort, by its very nature, obscures exactly the information you actually need in order to understand where you genuinely stand. What we haven't yet explored is exactly how to execute this small, deliberate withdrawal without it functioning as manipulation, punishment, or a game aimed at forcing a specific reaction. Why the distinction between genuine information gathering and manipulative game playing matters considerably more than it might initially seem, and what the different possible outcomes of this simple shift actually reveal about the relationship you're in, which is exactly where we need to go next. Let's talk about how to execute this small, deliberate withdrawal without it functioning as manipulation, because this distinction genuinely matters, and getting it right is what separates a useful diagnostic tool from something considerably less honest and considerably less effective. Here's the key difference worth understanding precisely. Manipulation involves deliberately creating a false impression, withdrawing while secretly hoping the other person interprets that withdrawal as something it isn't, in order to produce a specific, engineered emotional reaction that serves your own agenda, regardless of what's actually true. What we're describing here is genuinely different, because the withdrawal itself needs to be honest, not performed. You're not pretending to be busier than you actually are, or manufacturing a fake reason for your reduced availability while secretly waiting by the phone. You're simply genuinely redirecting your actual time and actual effort toward other things that deserve your genuine attention, things that exist independently of this specific relationship, rather than treating your withdrawal as bait deployed specifically to bring someone back toward you. This distinction matters enormously in practice because it determines what your internal experience actually is during this withdrawal, and that internal experience shapes everything about how the entire process unfolds. If you withdraw while secretly, anxiously monitoring for their reaction, checking whether they've noticed, whether they're responding the way you hoped, you haven't actually created genuine information gathering conditions at all. You've simply created a more passive-aggressive version of the same excessive investment we discussed, still oriented entirely around their reaction, still organized around producing a specific outcome, just expressed through absence instead of presence. Genuine withdrawal requires something considerably more honest, actually redirecting your attention, genuinely engaging with whatever else you've chosen to prioritize instead, allowing whatever happens on their end to unfold without your active monitoring or anxious anticipation. Let's talk about a specific, practical way to think about this shift, because it's worth grounding in something concrete rather than leaving it abstract. Before implementing this small withdrawal, it's worth honestly identifying what you'll actually be redirecting your effort toward, something genuinely worthwhile on its own terms, independent of what it might reveal about this other relationship. This might be time spent deepening a different friendship that's been neglected. It might be a personal project or interest that's been set aside in favor of prioritizing this person's needs and preferences. It might simply be genuine rest, time spent without any particular agenda at all. What matters is that this redirected time and attention has genuine value on its own, rather than functioning purely as a strategic void designed to create pressure. This matters because it changes the entire emotional texture of what you're doing. Withdrawal deployed purely as strategy tends to feel hollow and anxious while you're actually doing it, because there's nothing genuinely filling the space you've created, only anticipation of someone else's reaction. Withdrawal that redirects towards something genuinely valuable feels considerably different, because even if the other person never notices, even if they never respond the way you might have hoped, you haven't actually lost anything. You've simply spent your time and attention on something worthwhile, which means this entire process carries meaningfully lower risk than it might initially seem, precisely because its value doesn't depend entirely on producing your desired outcome. Now let's talk about the different possible outcomes this simple shift tends to reveal, because understanding what each outcome actually means matters considerably for how you interpret whatever you observe. The first possible outcome, and the one most people are secretly hoping for, involves the other person noticing your reduced presence and making some genuine effort to reconnect, reaching out, asking if everything is all right, showing some visible sign that your absence registered as meaningful to them. This outcome is worth understanding as genuinely useful information, though it's worth adding an important caveat. A single instance of renewed effort, prompted specifically by your withdrawal, isn't automatically proof of deep, lasting value. It's worth watching over subsequent weeks, whether this renewed engagement actually sustains itself once your presence returns to something closer to normal, or whether it was simply a temporary reaction to novelty, fading once the immediate discomfort of your absence has been addressed. The second possible outcome, considerably more painful but equally important to understand accurately, involves the other person simply not noticing at all, continuing forward exactly as before, entirely unaffected by whatever withdrawal you've genuinely, honestly implemented. This outcome deserves honest acknowledgement rather than immediate explaining away, because it's genuinely tempting, in the moment this outcome becomes apparent, to construct reasons why it doesn't actually mean what it appears to mean. They must be busy. They must not have noticed simply due to circumstance rather than genuine indifference. Surely, if I extend the withdrawal a bit longer or make it slightly more obvious, they'll eventually respond the way I'm hoping for. This impulse toward explaining away disappointing information is worth naming directly, because it's precisely the same impulse that likely kept the original excessive effort going for far longer than it should have, before you ever arrived at the point of trying this specific shift in the first place. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address what these different outcomes actually mean for how you should respond going forward. Why the information this simple trick reveals matters considerably more than any single interaction that follows it, and how to use this understanding to build something considerably more valuable than a single successful attempt to recapture someone's fading attention. Let's talk directly about what these different outcomes actually mean and how to respond to each one honestly, because this is where the real value of everything we've traced across this exploration comes together into something genuinely useful for how you move forward. If the first outcome occurs, genuine, sustained, renewed effort that continues beyond the initial reaction to your withdrawal, this is worth understanding as meaningful, though it's still worth watching over time rather than assuming immediate, permanent resolution. Remember what we've discussed throughout other explorations in this series about the difference between a single gesture and sustained behavioral change observed over meaningful time. If renewed effort continues consistently, independent of whether you've returned to your previous level of availability, this genuinely suggests the relationship holds real value for this person, value that had simply become obscured by the guaranteed, unconditional nature of your previous effort, rather than value that was never actually present at all. This is worth understanding as a genuinely hopeful outcome, one that suggests the relationship going forward might actually benefit from you maintaining a more balanced, less automatically excessive level of investment, allowing genuine reciprocity to develop rather than reverting back to the exact pattern that produced the original decline in appreciation. If the second outcome occurs, genuine indifference to your reduced presence, sustained over enough time that circumstance and coincidence can reasonably be ruled out as explanations, this deserves honest, clear-eyed acceptance rather than continued explaining away or repeated attempts to extend the withdrawal further, hoping eventually to produce a different result. This is worth naming directly because it connects to something we've traced throughout this entire series regarding the difference between healthy discernment and prolonged, hopeful waiting for evidence that simply isn't materializing. If genuine, sustained withdrawal produces genuine, sustained indifference, This is accurate, valuable information about where this relationship actually stands. Information considerably more reliable than anything continued excessive effort could ever have revealed, precisely because continued effort would have simply continued obscuring this exact truth indefinitely. Here's what's worth understanding about why this simple trick matters considerably more than any single relationship it might be applied to, because this is the deepest insight available from everything we've traced throughout this exploration. This shift from unconditional, ever-present effort toward honest, deliberate withdrawal that reveals genuine information isn't really a trick you apply once and then abandon. It's worth understanding as a genuine recalibration of how you approach relationships more broadly going forward, a permanent shift away from proving your worth through excessive unconditional effort and toward simply, honestly, allowing your presence to remain proportional to how genuinely it's being valued and reciprocated in return. This matters enormously because it protects you from something we've discussed throughout this entire series in different forms: the exhausting, ultimately unsustainable pattern of trying to earn appreciation through effort alone, effort that, as we established in Part 1, often works against its own intended purpose by removing exactly the scarcity that makes genuine value visible in the first place. Learning to withhold, honestly and without manipulation, isn't about becoming someone who plays games with relationships or withholds affection strategically as a permanent way of operating. It's about learning, genuinely and sustainably, to let your effort reflect actual reciprocity rather than automatic, unconditional generosity offered, regardless of whether it's actually being met in return. Let's close with something important worth understanding about what this entire exploration ultimately reveals, because it connects to something considerably larger than any single relationship or any single application of this specific trick. The discomfort you likely feel at the idea of deliberately withdrawing effort, even temporarily, even honestly, even for genuinely useful information-gathering purposes, is worth examining directly because it often reveals something worth addressing on its own terms. A belief, perhaps developed over considerable time, that your value depends on continuous visible proof, that stepping back even briefly risks losing something you can only keep by constantly, tirelessly earning it. This belief, understandable as its origins might be, isn't actually accurate, and everything we've traced throughout this exploration offers direct, practical evidence against it. Genuine value doesn't actually require constant proof in order to remain real. It requires accurate mutual recognition, and sometimes the only way to discover whether that recognition genuinely exists is to briefly, honestly step back and observe, clearly and without predetermined hope, exactly what remains when your automatic, unconditional effort is no longer there to obscure the answer. So if there's one thing worth carrying forward from everything we've explored throughout this entire series, let it be this: you were never actually required to prove your worth through endless, unconditional effort in order to deserve genuine appreciation. Real value in any relationship worth keeping doesn't diminish simply because your presence briefly, honestly becomes less guaranteed. If anything, it reveals itself more clearly in exactly those moments, and whatever you discover through this honest, simple shift, whether it confirms genuine reciprocity worth continuing to invest in, or reveals indifference worth finally, clearly accepting, either outcome offers you something considerably more valuable than continued uncertainty ever could: the accurate, undeniable truth about exactly where you stand, discovered not through demanding an answer, but simply through allowing the honest absence of your own excessive effort to finally, quietly reveal it. Let's go further into something worth examining more closely, because it deserves more than a passing mention: what happens inside you during the withdrawal period itself, separate from whatever the other person eventually does or doesn't do. This matters considerably because so much attention naturally gravitates toward the other person's reaction. Will they notice? Will they reach out? Will they finally understand what they've been taking for granted? That the internal experience of the person actually doing the withdrawing often gets treated as incidental, simply something to endure while waiting for the real information to arrive. This is worth correcting directly, because your own internal experience during this period isn't incidental at all. It's arguably the most valuable part of the entire process, and understanding why changes how you should approach it.